welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest is Professor John Klein. He's Senior Fellow and Space Strategist at Delta Solutions and Strategies, and he has authored a book, Fight for the Final Frontier, Irregular Warfare in Space. Welcome, John.
Welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Look, what is irregular warfare in space? Is it something what we used to see in the sci-fi books, or is it something more looking like Bourne movies or James Bond with sabotage and other stuff? What is that?
Oh, wonderful question. That's the usually the first question I get whenever I speak on my book. And I'll read one definition just for the sake of your audience. So, irregular warfare is apart from major conventional wars against an enemy who takes a similar approach. So that's the general definition for irregular warfare in general. And the spoiler alert is irregular warfare is not an irregular occurrence. It happens all the time. We've known irregular warfare by that definition for centuries, if not millennia, but it goes by different names. Certain names that are in vogue right now is asymmetric warfare. We've known it by guerrilla warfare, small wars under Charles Caldwell's book about 100 years ago. About 20 years ago, it was military operations other than war. Gray zone operations is kind of used today. It's elements of both, but there's irregular warfare elements there. On the maritime domain, James Cable wrote about gunboat diplomacy. So again, all these are ideas of conflict below the threshold of major force-on-force actions. So we see it all the time. The second question I have is, can you give us some examples? And that's the reason I wrote the book, was because, you know, I've been writing about space power theory and space strategy for 20 years, but in a Clausewitzian sense, in his seminal work on war, we didn't really see major force-on-force actions. Nobody was dying. It wasn't really violence. But space was an important part for competition and crisis. And we've actually seen it in Ukraine. So what are some examples of irregular warfare in space? GPS jamming on both sides, as we're seeing in Ukraine. Cyber attacks. Again, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we saw cyber attacks against commercial companies. And to commercial, again, the use of commercial companies as proxies and potentially proxy warfare is also included. And then also this rendezvous and proximity operations, you know, two satellites getting close in orbit. The next question that follows from your astute listeners is, well, John, what would be some examples of regular warfare in space? And that goes back to your question. It's more the realm of science fiction, and hopefully we can keep it that way. So that would be, again, major force-on-force actions in the space domain or against assets in space. So let's say a direct ascent hit-to-kill ASAT against a $500 million satellite, kinetic kill vehicles against high-end exquisite systems, space-to-space lasing, and then also everyone's favorite is rods from God. It's tungsten rods in low Earth orbit that would go after terrestrial targets. So we haven't really seen that, so that's a good thing, and we can hopefully keep it that way. But that would be an example of what regular warfare in space would be, as opposed to irregular warfare.
But isn't it legally forbidden to bring weapons to this space? Like, we have international agreements of keeping space a peace, science, and cooperation place.
Yeah, so we'll go back to the legal regime for space. We've been operating in space for decades. The most seminal international treaty for space behaviors and activities is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. And when you read through the treaty, one of the underlying themes is peaceful purposes. But when it comes to weapons, the weapons that are prohibited, i.e. not allowed, are nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. So it doesn't forbid weapons per se. It's just those two types, nuclear weapons and then weapons of mass destruction. You can't have them in orbit, and you can't have them on celestial bodies, so you can't put them on the moon. This was the genesis of that was kind of based on the Cold War. The United States was going to the moon, and there was concern about the Cold War going to space and the moon, and people basing ICBMs and other types of weapons. But those are the two prohibitions. Now, not everyone agrees. There's some folks who take a more, I'd say, liberal interpretation on what peaceful purposes it means. Hey, there shouldn't be any type of aggression or anything like that. But when you read the Outer Space Treaty, Article 5.1 of the UN Charter, the inherent right of self-defense, still applies, and the NATO treaty would also apply. So you can have military activities in space. Space has been militarized since the beginning. We've used satellites for communication, Earth surveillance, as we saw in Ukraine's invasion with the Russian tanks all lined up in a row on the road. That was courtesy of commercial space companies. So we know that it can be used for military use, but the concern is the weaponization. And weaponization is not the same as militarization, as I teach my poor students at the university level. So the weaponization, having capabilities that are purely for destructive nature, that's the big concern. But back to your central point, it's just nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction is not defined in the Outer Space Treaty. I'm joining you from outside of Washington, D.C. The U.S. interpretation of peaceful purposes has consistently been non-aggressive. So you can have military activities like we have been for decades, but what we're concerned about is aggression.
But we have seen like this contest in space with the Soviets starting their satellites and the first astronaut to space. Then the US Americans responded with their shuttle program with multi-usage spaceships which can return back to Earth, and the moon program. So it was a constant concept, but that was what only the big player could allow. Soviet Union, the United States, China, later India, and other nations. We don't have like a separate space program even for Germany or like for other rich European countries. Like France does it, but France is a pretty separate case with nuclear weapons. But now we know that private actors send their missiles and their rockets to the space orbit. Does it mean that weaponization of space is now can be reached also by smaller actors?
The broader question is the commercial sector, the innovation that we've seen in the launch sector, and these on-orbit capabilities is increase what we call the democratization of space. Space is accessible to more powers than it was just the great space powers. So that is true. We do have Japan, South Korea, even North Korea have a semblance of a space program too. But the idea that you can buy capabilities, potentially even buy security or force, the use of force capabilities, is an idea that goes back millennia. The idea of if I don't have an army, I will procure an army that act on my behalf. But the commercial landscape is changing. That's where we see some of the best innovation, whether it's SpaceX or if you follow the news recently, we have companies putting up satellites to do on-orbit servicing and potentially refueling. It's changing dramatically. I do spend a little bit of time in the book on a chapter about the use of commercial, both in an offense or potentially defensive realm, and based on just historical experience. I have a mantra that I speak to for my students, and whenever I talk about the book, is space is not special, it's just wonderfully different. So we can look to how states and political entities behave on Earth to kind of figure out how they're going to behave in space too.
Can we expect terrorist attacks in this space?
All right, so that has to do with prediction and forecasting. I've been, like I said, writing for a while. I don't predict and I don't forecast. I use historical experience and strategic examples or understanding to kind of understand the range of the possible. As a space strategist and other folks who are focused on this, you have to plan for a range of potential futures. To answer your question specifically, one of the range of potential futures is potentially terrorists against space architectures terrestrially or in space. There's a range of things. You have to plan for the high end, the great power conflicts potentially in space, but also the low end, the terrorist actions who just want wanton destruction and don't really care about the shared use of space. So yeah, you do need to look at it. I don't know if it's going to happen, but it's something we need to consider.
Before we go further into details, how can we protect space and what threats can expect us there? Don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel. If you have your ideas or your comments, leave them under this video. And we are talking to Professor John Klein, who is a senior fellow and space strategist at Delta Solutions and Strategies. He has also authored a book, Fight for the Final Frontier, Irregular Warfare in Space. And you have already mentioned the vulnerabilities of this space. We know that there are a lot of concerns how accessible is the orbit, how can an explosion or destruction of a satellite make access to this space more complicated. How is the space protected from being spoiled by a conflict? Or is this like kinetic destruction is actually a very low probability and we need to concentrate on other threats like cyber attacks or other influences?
A wonderful question, and that's one of the more important things. Like, how do we, for Western liberal democracies, and we want to share the use of space, guarantee the right of access and use to all. How do we protect that against countries that would have wanton aggression or to spoil the use of space for everybody? And that goes a little bit to what we call deterrence theory. So how do you dissuade or affect the decision calculus of would-be aggressors not to attack your systems in orbit or just to indiscriminately spoil it for everyone else? So when we look at Western views on deterrence theory, it's usually broken up by deterrence by punishment. If you mess with me, I'm going to hit you back hard and you'll regret messing with me. I usually show a picture of two boxers in the ring. So two boxers, you don't want to hit me because I'm bigger than you and I have a longer reach and you're going to regret it. The other side of deterrence is deterrence by denial of benefit. And I usually show a picture of if you go to a U.S. county fair, you put on these padded suits and it's two people in a ring trying to push each other out. That's over padded. It's hot. Folks get tired and sweaty and they give up. Neither one of these two people in these padded suits is going to hurt each other. So that conveys the futility of action. So deterrence by denial of benefit, I am denying you any benefit that would come through aggression against me. In the space community, we know this as space mission assurance and resilience. This has been written about since 2015 as far as what space mission assurance and resilience is. And what it is just a whole lot of space capabilities. It's different orbitology, such as low Earth orbit, mid-Earth orbit, geostationary. It's different companies, different providers providing the same services. It's robust space architectures and networks associated with it. And it can be non-space solutions. And if you have so much capability, kind of like what we're seeing today, especially with proliferated low Earth orbit and some of the mega constellations, if you shoot down one satellite, I don't care. I got 9,999 left. So that kind of conveys to would-be aggressors, why would you actually escalate into the space domain if it's not going to matter? So that's how we kind of protect it for the United States. Our allies and partners are one of our greatest strategic assets, and along with our commercial partners too, the innovation that we see. So as we look to, if you read U.S. documents, we label Russia and China as rivals with strategic competition. So the U.S. looks to its allies and partners in its commercial sector to try to outcompete during this time.
But do you mean with this, like increasing the number of satellites, it makes no sense to shoot down only one or even 10 of them? Is it something like the Starlink project when you send like thousands of satellites into the space? They're very small.
Yeah, that's part of it. So that's what we call proliferated low Earth orbit. Starlink is in low Earth orbit. It has plans to have thousands of satellites in this constellation. That's one element. It's not the only element. It can be different companies. UK's OneWeb, China's having its proliferated constellation that it's going to put together. So there's a lot of interest in having these nearly ubiquitous satellites in orbit providing whether it's communications, Earth observation, and the like. But if you put them in different orbits, different providers. Again, you could use other ways to provide these services, like we do communications, and it's not just space-based. It can be terrestrial-based, cell phone towers, fiber, transatlantic cables. But if you have so much capability using multiple sources, you could convey the futility and deter wanton aggression. So yeah, to your point, Starlink is part of that. It is not the only part, though.
If we go to the Starlink case, we know that a lot of soldiers in Ukraine fighting the Russian invasion are relying on Starlink for their communication. And there was a partnership between Pentagon and Elon Musk's company providing these services. Then the Ukrainians said that some links, some communication has been cut. Elon Musk denied it. We have rumors from Ukraine that the Russians use the communication once again. Elon Musk denies it. We don't know what is the truth, but what is obvious is that the role of a private company in an interstate conflict where the company is a vital part of communication, doesn't it bring some additional risks or uncertainty for international politics?
It does. The role of commercial companies or space companies in particular is changing our understanding of what competition and potential conflict in space looks like. But I'll go back to this idea that space is not special. We've had commercial providers or non-state entities participate in conflict in the past. Sometimes these are private military companies and the like, so that we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. You had the Wagner Group that we saw in Ukraine and elsewhere. So that's the interesting part. Starlink doesn't fall in that category of a private military company, but the use of commercial companies, we'll call it as proxies, providing proxy capability that militaries can use, that's only going to increase. And it's going to increase on both sides. So we should expect that rivals to the West will use commercial companies, maybe third parties that aren't considered part of an aggressor or an adversary, but they're going to reach out and try to use everything that they have. So for the question, we know based on Putin's comments, he considers Starlink an extension of the United States. Implicit is that it's acting in a military capacity. So I would expect Putin and any rivals to the United States to potentially target commercial capabilities if they're providing military advantage in times of conflict. But for the West, we have to ask a similar question. Do we feel okay going after the commercial companies that are used by rivals in times of conflict? And sometimes you may say, well, of course we will. Well, we have this thing, the law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law, where we say we separate the military from the non-military object in conflict. So are we going to target a third party's non-military capabilities? Well, we say we're not going to. So these are questions we know we're going to have to ask at some point. Let's ask those questions. Let's have a dialogue, the United States with its allies and partners. How do you feel about this? Is there different levels of comfort? We should probably expect that because conflict is ultimately a political decision, and we should expect our state leaders to weigh in on their comfort level. It may depend on the type of conflict. We saw when Russia invaded Ukraine, we had some commercial companies pulling out of Moscow and the like just because they saw that the activity so egregious and violent. So it is a growing field. We don't fully understand the implications, I have a sense, but we know it's an important question to ask.
If we look at the space, and you have already described different ways of distorting the activities of your rivals or even harming them by destroying their property or their assets, have we seen in the recent past such attacks in this space? And is it possible to prove that these attacks took place?
We jamming and lasing of satellites on orbit is a fairly common occurrence. So jamming of, like we saw mentioned, GPS, so that's the ground segment signal. Uh, Satellites are lased for a variety of reasons. Sometimes people just want to see what happens. The other part of it is cyber attacks. So the cyber domain and space domain are somewhat intertwined. So cyber attacks against space architectures, the network systems that satellites use for their data and their storage, that's part of it too. So back to what I why I wrote the book was irregular warfare. These actions that are below the threshold of major force-on-force actions, we have seen for some time. But in the West, we don't really respond to these lesser intrusions or nefarious or malicious actions because it doesn't rise to the occasion to warrant a military response. But would-be rivals understand I can continue to operate maliciously, nefariously. If I don't destroy anything, nobody dies. Uh, so they can continue just to use time as a weapon, this protracted strategy of to achieve political gains. But we have seen that, but what we haven't seen is the major, what I would call a space warfare in a traditional, regular context.
But if I come a bit back to the start of your answer when you mentioned jamming of the GPS signal, we know that there is a lot of jamming on the front line in Ukraine, where you may not rely on any GPS. That is extremely useful against drones on both sides, or can also impact the GPS-guided missiles of HIMARS, multiply launch rocket systems. But we also observed jamming of GPS in Poland, Norway, and Finland in the Baltic Sea area. How does it technically work? What do you need to jam satellite GPS signal on such a huge area?
Well, the idea of GPS jamming is not a new idea. We saw that in the Gulf War area. Our GPS satellites, or most position navigation and timing satellites, are in mid-Earth orbit. We have the U.S. GPS system. We have the Russian GLONASS system has some of those. We have the European Union's Galileo, and we have Chinese Beidou. So these are all position navigation timing constellations that basically send out a signal. If you have 4 satellites producing this signal, you can use 1 for timing and 3 for triangulation to determine your location. And then with your smartphone, I use GPS courtesy of the U.S. Space Force to get tacos and pizzas delivered to my house, which is a miracle. So we have that, but these satellites are very, very far away. And if you study, if you've taken physics, you understand propagation of power. But if you have a closer signal to something that's a transmitting that's closer to you, you can potentially override or jam a further away signal. So these are thousands of miles away, GPS. So if you can get closer with a modest power generation, you can jam a signal. If you've ever driven with an AM radio on, when you get between different transmitting stations, you kind of like lose one signal, the next one comes in as you get closer to it. It's the same idea of signal propagation. It doesn't really, as long as you know what the frequency is, and you can build a transmitter. It's a very rudimentary technology, but you're spot on. We're seeing it on both sides. Maybe that's an indicator when we look at future competition and crisis. We should see that, maybe.
But that means that practically using the ground-based stations, radio stations, which emit powerful signal, you can disrupt the navigation also for public, for civil purposes, like the navigation of the civil planes, passenger planes, and that endangers a lot of people. Is it something which can be punished by the international law, or is it the area where you practically say, okay, as long as they don't catch me, I can do whatever I want, and even if they catch me, I will deny. They cannot force me to stop disrupting their signal.
So I'll go back to historical experience. We've seen it. We've seen it before. We should plan on GPS jamming in the future. If you look at my old models over here, there's some airplanes. Uh, so when you fly, you mentioned the passenger plane. GPS is one of the forms of navigation. There's probably 3 or 4 other ones that most major airliners use. They have TACAN, radio beacon, they have ring laser gyros, internal navigation. They can use their eyes to look for visual cues, among others. So, you know, we know airlines will use that, and militaries train for a range of potential futures too, to uh, operate in environments where GPS is denied. So it's not going to stop competition and conflict. It's not stopping what's happening in Ukraine. So you just need to be able to work around it and use other methodologies. Will it be banned? Right now you're not supposed to interfere with the radio frequency signals of other state actors of their systems. We already have that in law, but it's being disregarded by some.
If we look at the area of civil usage of space and protecting the space from being weaponized, we have already mentioned the actors like the United States, Russia, China, Japan, South Korea, other nations are entering this area too. What should we expect in the future? Should it be like more state actors or more international actors? Can we see the future of like the US, Canada, the EU bloc using the space? Or will we see more private actors in the space?
I think you'll see more international cooperation and the use of commercial actors. And I'll point out the US's Artemis program. So the US plans to go back to the moon with its allies that signed on to the Artemis Accords. I think last count there's 35 countries that have signed on to this. Basically, the principles to go back to the moon, how to do it responsibly, safely. So 35 countries, that's pretty significant on what they agree upon as safe and responsible behavior going back. But if you follow the news, there was the first U.S. commercial company that landed on the moon. It may have tipped over or something like that, but we know commercial companies are going to be part of this program going back to the moon too. I think more and more countries will participate in space, whether it's for science and exploration like the moon program, or putting up more satellites for other services, or even using those services that these ubiquitous mega constellations provide. I think that's the increasing trend. The technology is maturing. Our understanding of the capabilities of what space satellites can provide is improving too. But you really can't rule out the commercial. I think it's going to be side by side. For some, the U.S. has its model. It has large programs for both civil and military uses. European partners have a model of public-private partnership. They kind of pool resources to have these major programs. The European Union's Space Commission, the European Space Agency, and the like. So I think we'll see more of that, whether it's pooling in an international regime or organization. The commercial piece, we should expect Western commercial, and then we should see probably Chinese commercial too going.
Is what we know now about cooperation in space and our legal basis for this cooperation and exploration of space, is it enough for the next steps? We already discussed since many years colonization of Mars. Okay, not in the form, of course, of creating colonies, but sooner or later we will have a human astronaut landed on Mars. Is it something which is covered by current understanding and legal agreements of what we may do, what we may not do in space?
Uh, Wonderful question. It is hotly debated, depending on who you ask. So I'll tell you the safe answer. So the Outer Space Treaty says the launching state is liable for operations, has to register objects. So we have this earthbound reference, a legal system to consider activities in space, whether it's the moon and near Earth orbit. I've heard through secondary sources that SpaceX and Elon Musk in particular may not agree that earthbound legal systems should go to Mars. Maybe we start over. But the Outer Space Treaty, as written, says that the earthbound states, the countries have legal obligations to act in certain ways. I've seen enough science fiction movies to say that eventually the Martians will want to form their own government, and that the evil Terrans are no longer going to keep them down. So that sounds somewhat futuristic, but it needs to be figured out. But as it stands right now, through the UN bodies and the like, we're going to use our legal regimes that we have presently in the form of the Outer Space Treaty, the International Telecommunications Union, other international fora to say how we should operate when we go to the moon and eventually go to Mars.
So, on the basis of, let me say, analogy, we acted on the moon a certain way, so why not to extend it to other objects in the solar system? But if we look at another situation, or quite opposite one, not expanding to the space, but being practically banned from the space, there had been models which say if there will be a major collision in space or an artificially produced explosion in space, it can create a lot of small objects which would practically deny the entry to lower orbit. Is this some realistic scenario? Is it something we should be afraid of?
Yeah, it's something that weighs on my mind. So we'll talk a little bit about the orbitology and the kinetics of it. So if you satellites in low Earth orbit are traveling faster than bullets fired from a gun. So if in theory, anything in space that's moving around the Earth is a weapon if two things collide. So as two satellites collide, they can create debris. This is a conjunction and debris fields. Sometimes the debris can cascade and create other debris. If that takes an extreme, it's called the Kessler syndrome, which is debated too in some communities. So the idea that we have to act responsibly and safely in low Earth orbit, and actually all orbits, makes sense because like the international water, space is a shared domain. So my behavior, if I create debris, trash in orbit, it can affect your ability to use it too. So there's a long-term sustainability guidelines that the UN put out about how state agencies should act to try to promote, reduce the amount of debris that's created new and to mitigate some of the debris on orbit presently. We know it's a concern. Space is only getting more congested with both satellites and debris that we can track. For all the debris that we can track, there's a lot more that we cannot. And even a small piece traveling as fast as a bullet, if it hits your spacecraft, it can destroy it. So it is a concern. I do like the analogies that you mentioned, because in the maritime and land domains, we know that sometimes indiscriminate actions or weapons that operate, such as usually anti-personnel mines, are banned by most international conventions. So because it hurts civilians when they're trying to cross and impacting children and the like. In the maritime domain, we say that open water mines are banned. So we don't want to have these mines that just float around in the sea that you could impact a cruise liner or a military ship or the like. So I think the space domain, there's a lot there. We don't want to have weapons in space that act indiscriminately against friend and foe alike.
But is that something we have seen recently in the space, like a piece of a debris of space trash, like hitting a space satellite and destroying it, or is it still the area of possible but not what we see constantly? Because we know there is a lot of debris, a lot of objects which are circulating on the low orbit without being guided from Earth. But do we see our space satellites being destroyed?
So we've seen damage to satellites, not as we understand intentionally. We've done anti-satellite testing. The U.S. has done it, Russia, India, China, and the like. But conjunctions or unintentional destruction of two country systems, that was the Iridium satellite and the Roscosmos satellite. I forget which year, but that was it looked like the Iridium satellite had a conjunction with the Roscosmos satellite and destroyed both. So we have seen it. That wasn't intentional or malicious, but it does happen. It's probably going to happen more and more as we get, thousands and thousands of satellites that have to move towards the Earth to deorbit. There is concern. There has not been any indication of a intentional weapon to that effect that's operating in the space domain to cause large amount of debris as an indiscriminate obstacle to all.
And of course, when something happens to your satellite in the space, you don't know, like, what was it at the end. Your satellite is destroyed. The debris are being destroyed by entering the atmosphere, and you don't know what caused this loss of the satellite. So even if it was somehow by purpose, by a rival, you most probably will not be able to prove it, right?
Yep. I wonder if you read my recent book, because that's a spot-on question. I talk about space attribution. So because these satellites are operating thousands of miles away, if a satellite fails, the question may be asked, well, what caused the failure? Was it a solar flare? Was it a piece of debris? Or was it intentional? So this has to do with understanding the space domain awareness, what's happening in the space domain, what's happening to spacecraft that I own. Am I being jammed? Am I being lased? Was it a piece of debris? Is there a rival satellite in proximity of mine? Do I know? Do I know what that rival satellite is capable of doing? So these are important areas. There's increased awareness that these are important questions to ask. If you read U.S. strategy documents, you can see space domain awareness and this idea of needing to attribute actions in space is a growing importance. There's still room to grow in that regard and more capabilities that need to be developed, though.
That is a very interesting perspective, and of course there are much more questions, especially in this space, than we have answers. And with the development of this area, we will have even more questions we need to find answers to. It was Professor John Klein. He's a senior fellow and space strategist at Delta Solutions and Strategist, and he has also authored a book, Fight for the Final Frontier, Irregular Warfare in Space. Thank you, John.
Thanks for having me on.
And don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel, and wait for the new interviews.